Good Monday morning, everybody. My name is Alan Yu. I'm the Senior Vice President for National Security and International Policy here at the Center for American Progress. CAP really welcomes this opportunity to discuss the range and complexity of the China challenge to the United States, how CAP assesses these challenges, risks, and opportunities, and our recommendations to policymakers for a progressive, principled, and pragmatic approach to China policy. You know, the U.S. China relationship is really the most consequential bilateral relationship for the United States, for China, and really globally. China poses to the United States the greatest and most complex challenges we've faced in our history across a range of issues: political, economic, security, technology, the U.S. geopolitical standing, and in climate change, the survival of the planet. You know, there are some who characterize China as an existential threat to the United States for U.S. security, prosperity, and our value system, and advocate for a U.S. strategic response commensurate with defeating an existential threat. Yes, China poses great challenges, but these are challenges that the United States can confront with confidence and surmount with a smart balance of ambition and measure and smart and robust public and private investment. And policymakers need to explain that vision to the American people who recognize the challenges posed by China, but also recognize the strength and resiliency of the United States, its values, and the way we do business. According to a poll commissioned last fall by National Security Action, the American people accept the need for the United States to compete with China, but do not support confrontation. They recognize there will be circumstances when both countries and the world can benefit from collaboration, and they count on policymakers to find those opportunities. So it was in that context that this project came about as a response to these imperatives from the American people. Moreover, it was clear to us that the predominant anti-China political atmosphere in Washington drives an often reflexive, conflictual response. But many of these challenges that we face merit a more considered approach. We saw an importance in bringing a measured, progressive perspective to discussions over the challenges facing the United States and China. Our aim was to provide a progressive, principled, pragmatic framework, one, to assess and act upon some of the major U.S.-China issues, and two, from which to explain that approach to the American people. It's important to reset the discourse in the context of this reflexive, negative China political orientation. So I called on Dave Rank to run a smart, considered process. Dave is a senior advisor at the Cohen Group, where he heads its China's practice, and is now a senior fellow at CAP. Dave is uniquely qualified to lead this project. Earlier in his career, he served almost 30 years as a U.S. diplomat, including 6 tours on the mainland and in Taiwan. The last as the acting ambassador and deputy chief of mission in Beijing. To launch the project, he and I drew on some top China and Washington experts to lead processes in their areas of expertise, to analyze the most complicated issues in their topic areas, and to propose a corresponding set of policy recommendations. We're fortunate to have several of them on this webinar today. Ryan Mulholland is a CAP Senior Fellow for International Economic Policy, and he led the Trade Working Group. Joanna Lewis is the Associate Professor of Energy and Environment and Director of the Science, Technology, and International Affairs Program at Georgetown School of Foreign Service, and she led the Climate Change Working Group. So let me turn it over now to Dave to describe the principles that guided our approach, some key recurrent themes, and some of the top-line assessments and recommendations. We'll then have the other panelists join and tell us about some of the key issues and policy solutions that they proposed. And we'll plan to give plenty of time for audience Q&A. So please submit your questions for the panelists by typing them into the Zoom chat. And with that, let me turn it over to Dave.
Great. Thanks, Alan. And good, like you say, good Monday morning. Uh, it's good to be here. I should start. I joke, when Alan asked me to do this project, I told him and asked to bring together a group of people like the folks you see on the panel here, that I'm not a professional progressive. I and most of the people who took part in this project really came at it from an angle of having worked on and studied China for a long time. And so as we thought about, what are the principles that should underpin this effort, the first one was kind of defining what does it mean to be progressive in the context of China policy. So that was kind of the first principle we had to tackle. And I wanted personally to keep it as simple as possible, and to say just this, that the policy should first and foremost look at how our policy affects the interests of ordinary Americans, because they're the ones who are going to who feel the impact of, for example, trade and economic policies most directly and most acutely, and frankly, who would most directly and most acutely feel the impact if competition and confrontation were to slide into actual conflict. So that's kind of the most fundamental principle that we came into this effort with. But the second I would say is frankly that we should be, one of the principles we honor should be, we should respect our principles as Americans, American values. Not only because they inform who we are as Americans, but also because those values and principles, I think, are an extraordinary asset as we think about the competition that we face in the coming years. The final one is pragmatic. I'm not sure how to sum that up better than the goals we shoot for should be goals that are within the United States power to achieve. And I guess I'll illustrate that not with an example, but with a counterexample. I've seen some talk in town about one of the goals of U.S. policy should be that the Chinese people will choose an alternative form of government, one that's more amenable to American interests. And I'm not gonna, I mean, that there are some really valuable things in that goal, but it's just not something within U.S. power to achieve. And I think sort of that runs into our fourth principle I want to highlight, is just a sense of humility, that there are limits to American power. There are limits to what the United States can do. I come at that not only from, as you said, Alan, 30 years working in the U.S. government on China issues for much of that time, but I also spent 4 or 5 years working in and on Afghanistan, where we spent, 20 years and about $1 trillion and lost more than 2,000 American lives, and really didn't affect the trajectory of that country significantly in the long run. And so, in a country like Afghanistan, where we had that extraordinary influence, if our reach was limited, I think we have to be even more humble about our ability to influence China's overall direction. The country we can influence most is the United States, and that's where our focus should be. And that was one of the main themes of all of the groups that we brought together, 8 different working groups led by people like Ryan and Joanna and Nathan Mabubi from the University of Pennsylvania, who I hope will be able to join later, but he's run into some technical issues, who ran our democracy group. One of the themes was our work starts at home, that kind of getting back to the country we can influence, whether it's economics or trade or military competition. Really, the bulk of the work we need to do is not with China, but with the United States. Investments here, looking at what's succeeded in the past, things like the Inflation Reduction Act, things like the bipartisan infrastructure bill, the Chips and Science Act, and a range of other activities that we can do here at home. The second, I would say, there's a theme that runs through the 8 different groups, and I'll talk about those in a second, is that just as there are things we should be concerned about, I think we also need to step back and recognize that we have done a number of things extraordinarily well, that we have a lot of assets that if you walk around Washington or listen to people in Washington today, you would think that China's 10 feet tall and we are just crawling on our elbows. That's not the case, and I think we need to recognize that. And the last theme that heard across all of the working groups was that we need to talk. Talk is, talking to Dave Rank, I joke, is no reward. We need to have difficult conversations. We need to have conversations to make sure that competition does not slide into conflict, because I think that'd be disastrous, not just for Americans and Chinese for the world. And finally, we need to cooperate not as favors to each other, but cooperate because it's in both of our countries' interests to do so. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ryan and Joanna in a second to talk about the working groups they oversaw. But obviously, as you said, Alan, it's a large, complicated relationship, and part of our effort was to break that relationship down into manageable pieces. So we a little bit less than arbitrarily identified 8 issue groups and told people like Ryan and Joanna, you have 3 pages to summarize what is the essential meat of the issues that the United States faces in those areas. And if you can't get it in 3 pages, this is you're going to have to throw it out of the lifeboat, because one of the goals is to be able to talk to people who have a lot on their plate, and there's a lot of things on people's plate in Washington today, and really get to the heart of things. And so those baskets are trade, that Ryan will talk about in a minute, climate, but also technology, Taiwan, military cooperation, human rights and democracy, China's role in the world, and then finally a cooperation agenda. And of course, as you go through those 8 topics, there's a lot of overlap. We probably missed a couple of issues that we had to shoehorn into places that don't necessarily fit. But with that, maybe Alan, I'll stop and turn it back to you, or should I turn it straight to Ryan?
That's great, Dave. Happy to take it from here. Dave, thanks. I think that you really did a good, really comprehensive summary of kind of what we were trying to do and what guided us. So I wanted to maybe just start it off with you to kind of as the lead on coordinating the project. Got a feel for how you and I and the others on this project thought about the framing of all of these topics in a progressive, pragmatic, and principled way. I wonder if you could just look at Secretary Blinken's trip to China last week, and I wonder if you might just comment a little bit on how the administration is approaching the China challenge, and how that approach fits within the frame of the way that we looked at the set of challenges.
Sure. First of all, I think Blinken has done the right thing. Biden has done the right thing in their China policy. And look, there's nothing new under the sun. The approach that we laid out is not a set of recommendations for the executive branch. I think the executive branch, certainly under this president, has the right approach, which is first look at the United States, look at our strengths, but also look at our weaknesses, look where we need to invest more. And then go out and do it. I think one of the real challenges in Washington is going from talking about problems to doing things about problems. And so, with the IRA investments, with efforts to get our economic house in order and our commercial house in order, it then makes it easier to have the kinds of discussions we need to have, whether it's Janet Yellen, whether it's Tony Blinken in Beijing. And the second in that step is, and as I talk about this, I recognize that one of the recurring themes was, one of the real strengths the United States has is the strengths of our partnerships abroad, the alliance network we have, the formal and informal partnerships we have. And so, I think it's not a total coincidence that Tony Blinken went out after we had the Japanese prime minister in and the president of the Philippines, that we have done a lot of work with allies and partners leading up to conversations with the Chinese. Not, as Beijing likes to say, because we are encircling China, but because the partnerships and alliances we have make sense as an overall strategy towards the world. And then the final comment I'd make about the Biden trip is, the Tony Blinken trip, is that Tony Blinken went. And there's a lot of criticism that cabinet secretaries going to China. I think it's important to demonstrate that airplanes fly both ways, that Chinese officials can get on a plane and come out to the United States, come to Washington, and just having worked in Beijing for a long time, I will say, just as a practical matter, it is generally more effective for Americans to go out. An American cabinet secretary has a lot more ability to get things done when he's 7,000 miles away from his capital than his counterpart. So just as a very practical matter, I think it's probably more effective to have American cabinet secretaries there. I think you have to have Chinese cabinet secretaries coming here as well, having substantive conversations. My focus is on the pragmatic. If it makes more sense, if it's easier, if Tony Blinken has more authority to get things done operating in Beijing, and that means that he'll travel there more often than his Chinese counterpart comes to Washington, I think that's a outcome we can live with. So maybe I'll leave it there.
Great. Thanks, Saif. Appreciate it. Hey, Ryan, I wanted to turn to you. So a progressive approach to China seems to apply in particular to how CAP is advocating that the United States look at trade policy on China. Wonder if you could explain that a little bit.
Yeah, thanks, Alan. Happy to. So I think first and foremost, I had the real privilege of leading a really strong group of people who know China really well, who think about trade with China very deeply. And those conversations are not always easy. Trade is super complicated, as everybody knows, right? And so really digging in, I think, led to some good recommendations here. I think first and foremost, you have to start with the recognition that China is a competitor unlike any other. Our economy is more integrated with theirs than any sort of economic adversary that we've faced in the past, or economic rival that we've faced in the past. The amount of two-way trade between our two countries is significant, but also the amount of trade that comes from China through somewhere else into the United States, or vice versa, is significant. And that makes sort of very simple kind of solutions to trade kind of hard to find. There's no silver bullet here. I think the second thing that we sort of came across is pretty evident, and that is that we need a really broad suite of tools to be able to address the trade challenge with China, and that's both offensive and defensive tools. Smart, targeted, thoughtful tariffs, I think, are an appropriate tool to leverage as we try to de-risk our supply chains. With that being said, though, we also have to make investments in our own people, in our own industries, invest in R&D, figure out what technologies we want to be a world leader in, put a plan together to make sure that we can create and maintain that leadership. And that ultimately, when something is invented here because of an investment by the U.S. taxpayer, that it's ultimately made here by U.S. workers. I think, too, we can't expect China to change its ways. This goes to the humility point that Dave was making. What we need is sort of a modern toolkit of authorities in order for us to invest in ourselves and protect our industries when necessary, based on sort of the characteristics of a modern economy. And then I think, too, we need to find ways to talk to China. This is a point that we've made again and again on this webinar, but it's really true in trade, right? Secretary Raimondo at the Commerce Department initiated this commercial issues working group. I think that's a great start to make sure that there's a platform and a place, a forum to have difficult conversations around trade. That doesn't mean that you're going to, give away the store, but it does mean that you can be honest. You can back up kind of your people when necessary, but also look for opportunities for collaboration. And as the world's two largest economies, there are places in the global economy that the two countries can find to work together. Last point I'll make on trade, and then happy to turn it over to my colleagues, is that, for a long time, China's non-market practices, export subsidies, theft of intellectual property has been blamed for declines in U.S. manufacturing. And there is no doubt that those types of practices certainly contributed to a decline in American manufacturing competitiveness. But I think often it's a foil for us not taking a hard look at bad practices, bad trade policy practices that the United States has pursued over the last 30 or 40 years that also led to a decline in our manufacturing, right? And so as the Biden administration takes on a very strong pro-worker, worker-centric trade policy, aligning that with also addressing some of the challenges that China's practices have put on the table, I think is really important. So I will stop there and happy to turn it back to you, Alan, and answer questions later.
Great. Thanks, Ryan. Yep. You definitely put a lot of provocative questions out there. So look forward to hopefully some interesting questions from the audience. Let me turn to Joanna Lewis, who headed up the climate change working group process. Joanna, I guess a similar question to you. I mean, what does a progressive agenda for engaging with China on climate look like? I mean, we're looking at some real tough questions. I mean, how do we balance the need to get China to do more on climate change with the real concerns about clean technology competition between our two countries?
Thanks, Alan. I mean, I think we have to start off by recognizing that climate change is really one of the greatest challenges we face, right? I mean, it's an existential threat to our planet and to humanity. So, with that, we need China engaged in this topic, both because they are one of the largest causes of climate change in their role as the largest emitter of greenhouse gases and the largest, energy consumer of fossil energy in the world. But China is also a key part of the solution to climate change, including the role they play in the deployment of renewable energy technologies and other low carbon technologies. So I think the question that we face is how do we engage with China effectively and in a way that, sort of pushes the global interest in climate mitigation and also protects U.S. interests in clean energy technology. We've seen a lot of the engagement we've done has actually been extremely effective in the climate realm. I think when we talk about bilateral engagement with China, climate is really a no-brainer. I mean, it's an area where we can really point to a concerted bilateral effort can result in very concrete shifts, both in multilateral climate action as well as in domestic policy. And maybe just to give a couple examples of this, there was a really concerted effort by the former Obama administration in the years leading up to the Paris Agreement to engage multilaterally with China at the highest levels on climate policy. And I think it's safe to say we would not have had the success of the Paris Agreement that we did if you didn't have this sort of concerted bilateral conversation. It's really important, I think, to work out a lot of the challenges. We see a lot of time the language that can be reached through bilateral agreement in climate, in ozone, and other important multilateral environmental agreements, actually end up getting enshrined in multilateral deals. China really can bring along a lot of the emerging and developing world. And so I think everyone really looks to the U.S. China dynamic in the climate sphere, to really set the stage for global agreement. I think also just, nationally, the fact that we've seen such a big focus in the last couple of years bilaterally with the U.S. government really pushing on methane abatement. This is really an area it's the second largest, most important greenhouse gas in the world. And something that had essentially been left off the table by Beijing, but now is part of a national plan to reduce methane abatement. And again, very important to have China at the table here is, being responsible for about 10% of global methane emissions. So, I think we see that there's real value in engagement on climate, but also I think it's key to remember that the United States is more effective in pressing for more action from China if we can demonstrate ambitious action at home, right? And this gets to what the others were saying about the real importance of the investments we're seeing driven by the IRA and related policies to really promote clean energy manufacturing deployment and broader climate abatement programs across the United States. This really brings us, much more political influence on this topic. We also have, the technical expertise, and again, this history of bilateral engagement can just be crucial for engaging China in a smart way that, still protects U.S. competitive interests.
Thanks, Joanna. Hey, I wonder, maybe what I'll do is if I could put the question out there to both Ryan and Joanna on this question about, in particular, on the clean technology competition, because this was a topic that obviously is quite topical in, in the U.S. policy debate these days, but also a topic that, has implications on how we look at trade, as well as on action on climate. It was this question about this heightened concern about U.S. exports, heightened concern in the United States and Europe about Chinese exports of highly subsidized clean energy products like EVs, solar panels, and wind turbines. Could each of you tell us a little bit about some of the questions that you wrestled with in your respective groups? And then I'll make the point that we also did have opportunities where the working groups kind of engaged each other to try to kind of iron out perspectives on this. And then maybe talk a little bit about some of the policy recommendations that we came out with. Maybe what I'll do, let me start with Ryan and then Joanna.
Yeah, sure. So this is a question that's obviously like most things in trade, complicated, right? If you cared only about deployment, I think there's a very rational argument for we should allow into our country as many subsidized EVs or solar panels or what have you, so we can deploy them as fast as possible. I think, though, you have to take other considerations into account. And one of those is if you want climate action to be enduring, if you want to build the domestic constituencies that allow for climate action to be enduring in this country, our workers, our citizens, our communities deserve to be part of a future where they are producing the technologies that we need to address the climate challenge. And I would even suggest be a producer that potentially could export to other countries around the world to help other countries meet their climate targets as well. That the world shouldn't have to rely on a single producer, China, to make the things that our world needs to address climate change. And so you're trying to balance multiple interests here. There's both a deployment interest and a domestic manufacturing competitiveness interest. Those are both valid things, but policymaking is often about prioritizing. And I think there's a world where U.S. producers can play an important part in the future, and we want to make sure that we move from where we are today, which is we're not a large producer of solar panels. We want to be an important player in the EV space and the EV battery space and other climate technology spaces. And we have to get from here to there. And so putting in place sort of the types of policies that will enable that to happen is pretty important.
Joanna?
Yeah, I would just add, I agree with what Ryan said, that we need to, of course, weigh our desire to have climate action against other national economic and national security goals, right? But I think we can't look just at the United States in isolation, right? This is a global challenge. And we know, for example, that shifting manufacturing of solar panels from China to the United States will increase their cost, which will increase the cost, of the broader low carbon transition. Because most of these technologies need to be deployed in the developing world, not in the United States, right? That's where we see sort of the vast majority of capacity that will be needed to, try to limit warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees. But that said, I do think that there are sort of smart ways to weigh these trade-offs of, for example, U.S. market entry of Chinese products or technologies, or relying on supply chains from China. That's not just a one size fits all, right? I think the real challenge that we're arguing for is to take a more nuanced approach. I think there are certainly areas where it may make sense to restrict market entry or to restrict technology transfer. But in other areas, I think we would be putting our own firms at a major competitive disadvantage. For example, I do think the electric vehicle sector is a really complicated one. And again, one that we need to be careful. There are a lot of US firms that are directly benefiting from licensing intellectual property from Chinese companies, right? Because these are among the most competitive, most innovative, advanced firms in the world, right? And I think there are ways to do this that, again, protect data security, privacy, and national security interests, right? And then allow us to balance a climate solution with an economic and national security, constraint. So I think what we try to do in the memo is to really look at this again in a sort of progressive but balanced way. And we actually recommend that, there are some areas where it may make sense to, allow US companies to license Chinese technology. There's other areas where it doesn't. And again, we're just arguing for this sort of more nuanced rather than just a blanket approach across the entire sector.
Yeah, if I could just add one other thing on top of that, and that is that if the US does go forward with sort of protective measures for our EV manufacturers, I think it's important that our EV manufacturers don't take that protection and then slow down the deployment of EVs, right? That comes with sort of the protection is a commitment from our EV producers, from our automakers, to deploy as fast as possible electric vehicles in this country, and also to not stand in the way of some of the worker rights and protections that the UAW, for example, has so successfully negotiated recently.
Hey, thanks to both of you. I think you really gave the audience a good sense for really the complexity of these questions, and as Joanna rightfully said, our attempt to really propose some nuanced and kind of principled but flexible approaches to how we deal with these challenges. Let me pivot a little bit to a different topic. I wanted to turn to Dave. Dave, we remarked as working as this team on the interesting timing of the release of our report just a week and a half ago, with right about the same time an essay by then China Committee Chair Mike Gallagher and Matt Pottinger, Donald Trump's Deputy National Security Advisor, and their view on kind of how a U.S. policy towards China should be. I wonder if you could comment a little bit on the kind of the compare and contrast of their view of things and ours.
Sure. First of all, I would say Gallagher is not Representative Gallagher, former Representative Gallagher, is not, wasn't a student of China as his background, but I've been really impressed listening to him and reading what he's written, his earnestness in wanting to understand the challenges we face, and his thoughtfulness in trying to address them. And so as I read through his article, I read with a mind opened by some of the stuff he has done and said in the past. That said, my sense of that foreign affairs article, and I encourage everyone to take a look at it. I think the title is "The Only Solution is Victory" or something along those lines. Looks at my sense of it is that it looks at the U.S.-China competition or relationship as primarily military, or at least the response to the challenge of China should be first and foremost a military response, with the sort of presumption that by carrying out a second Cold War characterized by a lot of military spending, it will push the Chinese people into changing the system into one that's more amenable to to U.S. interests. And I looked at it, and I think Representative Gallagher's recommendation was increasing U.S. defense spending from 3% of GDP to about 5%, 4 or 5% of GDP. So that means adding a couple of $100 billion a year to maybe $300 or $400 billion a year on top of, by my back of the envelope calculation, we spend about $1.2 or $3 trillion a year on defense if you include the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, if you include Veterans Affairs, which I think is a fair calculation, part of our defense spending. If you include the Department of Energy programs that go to nuclear weapons. So that would be going up to maybe $1.4, $1.5 trillion a year. I agree that part of the challenge we have with China is military, and we have to look at our military. Although my strong sense is that the Department of Defense has about an $800 billion a year budget. Rather than increasing that, I think absolutely the first thing we need to do is find out where that money's going. The Pentagon has never passed an audit. I think that would be a terrific first step. But I do recognize, and I agree completely that, if, as Representative Gallagher says, we think China is a genuine challenge, if we're not putting money towards it, if we're not then responding by investing in some way, then we're not really serious. And I just disagree with where those investments are. I think, for example, a follow-on to the IRA, a follow-on to the Chips and Science that might look at other parts of the U.S. economy that will be critical to the kind of competition, commercial and economic competition that we clearly face now and clearly are going to face in the future, will help prepare us for that competition, the sort of multi-domain competition that we clearly face with China, and frankly, at a fraction of the cost. That you could do another Chips and Science and IRA for something like $70 billion a year. That's maybe 20% of the increase that Representative Gallagher is talking about. Again, agree with some of the diagnosis, but the prescription based on that diagnosis, I think would lead us in probably a wrong direction.
Yeah, Dave, I think I fully agree with you. Like we've said throughout the report as well as today, we can meet the challenges that China poses in the security realm. We've got a really strong country. We've got a strong set of values. Our alliances are really put us in a position of strength and confidence, and there's undoubtedly room for us to be looking at how we're positioning ourselves strategically. But this is a challenge that I think that we can face without going into what I think is a really concerning direction in both rhetoric and potential deployment if we have a change in approach with the next administration. Let me turn to a kind of a broader question for the three of you. So I think we all acknowledge that the U.S. and China are really deeply interlinked, on economic, financial, cultural, academic fronts, really like no other global competitors have ever been. I wonder if each of you might identify an area within your focus areas and what opportunities or challenges pertain. Maybe I'll ask Joanna to take the first run.
Sure. I mean, I think the real challenge when we think about climate cooperation specifically is that, this used to be thought of as an area that we could sort of engage with China in isolation of the broader set of, economic and strategic issues, right? Because this was sort of an area where we had a lot of common interests. I think now, though, I think it's clear climate is just not something that is we can look at in isolation, because it's increasingly about trade issues. It's about competition, right? And a lot of the key technologies that are going to be so crucial to the low carbon transition. So I think that it is really important for the climate agenda to be integrated with how we think more broadly about engagement with China. And I think, one key example of this is the U.S. China Science and Technology Agreement, right, which is sort of our framework agreement, which was signed back in 1979 between, then President Carter and Deng Xiaoping, right? And this was really the agreement that brought China into the international scientific community. And now that China has really risen, become, a global scientific leader in its own right, there's sort of equal benefit to Chinese scientists and researchers and academics like myself to engaging with Chinese counterparts. But this agreement has been sort of caught up, right, in political headwinds, given the sort of broader concerns about science and technology engagement. And so I think that, we need to really remember sort of what are the fundamental benefits to having these sorts of framework agreements that allow for cooperation on energy and climate change and global health and these other key areas. But how do we, if we do need to renegotiate the terms, just allow this to go forward and be able to work out, any changing sort of regulations related to intellectual property or whatever we're worried about kind of in the context of the agreements themselves. I mean, we have experience with doing that in the context of bilateral agreements on clean energy, on pharmaceuticals, other areas. So I think that we want to sort of be careful to not hold up these broader, I think, really symbolic and important framework agreements, right, so that we can kind of allow engagement to go forward. But my point just sort of being like it's very hard to move forward on an issue like climate, where I think we all agree that there's sort of need to move forward because it's just become so tied up in the context of all the other topics where there are these much more bigger challenges.
Thanks, Joanna. Ryan?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of cooperation, there are a few areas where I think, by way of the U.S. and China being the world's largest economies, we would both benefit from figuring out a way to work together. Internationally, things like, addressing piracy, making, container shipping documentation electronic, supply chain transparency, all sort of topics that I think are ripe for China and the U.S. to kind of work together. And then I think too, I mean, in terms of like integration, one of the points that I think is important to make is that we need to kind of expand what we think of when we talk about trade policy. For decades, when trade policy comes up, it's either a conversation about tariffs or non-tariff barriers, maybe purchase commitments. We need to think about making an investment in our own country as just as an important part to trade policy as those other things. So building a new semiconductor factory in Ohio, building a new EV battery plant in Wisconsin are just as important to establishing our own competitive position vis-a-vis China going forward as tariff reductions. And so those things, we shouldn't separate, say, sort of more traditional trade policy things from investments in ourselves, because the two kind of go hand in hand and obviously support each other.
Great. Dave, any thoughts from your side?
Yeah, I'll very quickly, and it's not a directly parallel kind of cooperation, but I think, Joanna, you talked about climate, which is sort of existential from a sort of planetary level. I think the issue of fentanyl is an area where we have to figure out how to cooperate. Look, it is an American problem. 100,000 Americans died last year from fentanyl overdoses. But and so, I mean, we have a very clear need to solve that problem. Again, some of that, or a good part of it, has to be here at home at reducing the demand. But part of it's got to be China. China has I think, a critical need to address the problem of flows of precursor chemicals, either directly or indirectly, to producers of fentanyl. Because, if you talk to governors, if you talk to members of Congress, they'll tell you it is just poisonous to the U.S. China relationship until we get that resolved.
Thanks, Dave. Hey, let me let me pose one more question to Dave, and then we'll turn to questions from the audience. We covered a lot of different issues that the report addressed. I mean, one of the kind of core topics, challenges between the U.S. and China is the question of Taiwan. The U.S. is obviously interested in supporting Taiwan's continued, democratic governance, prosperity, and security. But that's kind of nearly in direct conflict to Beijing's perspective. As we looked at the Taiwan elections, earlier this year, and then Beijing's reaction then, as well as kind of subsequent, it seems, there's certain of Beijing's actions and rhetoric that continue to ratchet up. So, what, if anything, should Washington be doing in response?
Thanks, Alan. In my time in government, the Chinese very often said to us, American diplomats, you Americans, I'm paraphrasing, this isn't a quote, you Americans, you always want to solve problems. We Chinese, for insert a number of millennia, 2,000, 3,000 years, we've been surrounded by, we've been in a bad neighborhood. We've learned to manage diplomatic problems. And I look at the way the Taiwan issue, and it's really been an extraordinary success of American foreign policy because we not tried to solve a problem, but tried to manage a problem that's going to be really difficult to solve. And so the paper, we lay out, look, what the goal of U.S. policy needs to be is to maintain the situation where Taiwan's ability to sustain itself is assured, even as we don't foreclose the possibility of China's long-term goal, which it calls peaceful reunification. That is, I would say, leads to I think, mutually unsatisfying outcome where neither one of the three sides is entirely happy with where things are. But the alternatives are all much, much less positive. And so what that means is, as we look at, as Washington, as we look at what we do with Taiwan, we should look at, those decisions through the prism of, does it fundamentally improve Taiwan's ability to maintain itself? And, that means a preference for, I would just simplify it as substance over style or substance over stunts. And maybe I'll leave it there. If there are questions, we can follow up in questions from the audience.
Great. Thanks, Dave. Yeah, so we've got a few questions from the audience. Let me go take the first one to Ryan. This is a question. This is a question on outbound investment from Andrew Park. Andrew says there's increasingly been discussions about screening U.S. investors' outbound investments in China, given concerns about pension funds and university endowments inadvertently funding human rights abuses in Xinjiang and financing sensitive military and advanced technology development. Do you believe such an approach is helpful and complementary to the issues you all raised related to trade, climate, and U.S. industrial policy?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the short answer is yes, I do think they're helpful. The part of the issue that I think we face is that China has a sort of dedicated strategy to link both military and non-military together, right? And so if the goal is to make sure that China's military remains a step or two behind the U.S. in terms of technology, which I think we'd all agree is important to our national security, then you have to limit some of the technology and the IP and the investment that goes into the types of things that are sort of dual use, right? And increasingly more and more things are dual use. And so, yes, I think you can align sort of trade policy issues with export controls, with outbound investment screening, because of the issues you state, because of Xinjiang, because of sensitive military technology development and deployment. I think that all does make a lot of sense and is part of a coherent, comprehensive strategy.
Great, thanks, Ryan. Just looking at some of the other questions. Let me. There's a question about trade and climate from Donghui Yu. Let me. I'll see if Joanna and Ryan might want to take some of these. I think we addressed a number of these topics, but let me just read the question out and let the panelists respond. He says, do you think the U.S. is emphasizing China's overcapacity in green industry and possibly taking further actions will hinder cooperation on climate change? Is Elon Musk's visit to China and meeting with Chinese leaders a better way to address this issue? Can American companies be absent from the Chinese green products market when European companies are stepping up cooperation with China in this regard? I'll put it to both of you, but maybe Joanna, maybe I'll ask you if you could take the first run.
Sure, happy to start. I mean, I think this is, as we were talking about, this is really, there's a variety of things that I think need to be still kind of decided, right, from a U.S. perspective. I mean, first of all, I think, historically, there's been a big focus on the challenges with Chinese overcapacity and how this can lead to kind of artificially flooding markets. But, again, we can't look at these industries in aggregate. There are actually very specific things happening, for example, within the Chinese EV or even the battery industries. A lot of the subsidies and definitely in the solar industry, a lot of the sort of subsidies that were used over many years to build up these industries have now been phased out because the costs have come down so much. These are not industries that need subsidization anymore. I think particularly in Chinese electric vehicles, these are primarily private companies. Of course, we define sort of public and private somewhat differently in the Chinese context, right? But these are not, for the most part, large SOEs, right? These are relatively small, innovative private companies that are leading in this market. And then, of course, you have U.S. companies that are directly integrated, such as Tesla, right? Who, right now, Tesla exported, I believe, around the fifth of the EVs coming out of China came from its Shanghai gigafactory, right? So when we're sort of talking about the Chinese EV market, we need to sort of recognize there's already U.S. players in that market. There's already partnerships being built between sort of leading Chinese and U.S. EV firms. And so when we think about what sort of policy we're going to be launching, on trade that might affect these products, I do think we need to be careful, that we're, again, not just sort of putting U.S. companies at a major competitive disadvantage if they've already chosen sort of strategic technology partnerships in their own interest with IP protections with Chinese firms. So, not to get into this in too much detail, but again, we're just sort of arguing, I think, for a more nuanced approach as opposed to saying no Chinese products, no Chinese companies, right, in this market. I mean, I think by all metrics, if this is, EVs in particular is an area where there are Chinese technologies that are maybe a decade ahead of other countries, and I think we need to think about how you do strategic science technology partnerships, cooperation, engagement, that again allows us to take advantage of some of these products, which will be valuable in a U.S. market context as well as in a global context.
Ryan?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, these are very good questions. Kind of 2 points that I'd kind of add on top of Joanna's. One is that the playbook that China has used and potentially is using in things like EVs is pretty well known at this point, right? We saw this sort of overcapacity, what it did to our steel industry. We saw what overcapacity in the solar sector did to our solar industry, right? I mean, most of the solar technologies deployed around the world today were invented using U.S. taxpayer dollars and innovated at U.S. national labs, and we make like 2% of the world's solar panels. So we've seen the impact, right? And so knowing that that's coming, I think it's incumbent on us to figure out how do you address that in a way that makes sense for the climate, but also for our domestic industries, who again, I think deserve to have a place in building and deploying the technologies needed to address the climate challenge. Your point on Elon Musk, I mean, I think I just broaden out beyond Elon and just say that I think the U.S. business community does have an important voice to play in China and in the U.S., right? I mean, I think if you're thinking about who's buying and selling the goods, the component parts, the materials that go into supply chains, it's private industry in the U.S., right? And so I do think they have a voice. And I think to the extent that they can use that voice to push China in a direction that is more transparent, treats workers better, doesn't, no forced labor like there is in Xinjiang, I think they can be sort of a voice for positive good here. That doesn't mean it's always the case, but I do think there's an opportunity for industry to play a constructive role here.
Right. Thanks to both of you. So the last question we have is from, it's actually a couple of questions from Chao Wu, and it relates to kind of Chinese Americans in the United States and some of the political atmosphere that we are dealing with. So he says the U.S.'s purge of scientists and professors, Chinese American scientists and professors that began in the China Initiative continues to racially profile Chinese Americans, Indian Americans, or other Asian Americans. How do you see this issue? And then related to that, he added another question: banning Chinese Americans buying land, houses, even going to graduate schools in Florida is let's see. Is problematic. How do you see this issue? Let me just say, very clearly from the top that CAP stands very strongly against anything that smells of racial profiling, not just as it pertains to Chinese Americans and Asian Americans, but across all such groups. So we say very clearly in the report that the United States needs to hold strong to its values. The values of equal treatment, equal opportunity are ones that are core to not just to CAP, but also should be ones that all Americans agree to. So we speak out very strongly against any such instances that as Chao points to. And again, what we say is that we need one of our core strengths as Americans is our values and our value system, and that's something that we can't lose sight of as we face the and consider appropriate responses to the challenges posed not just by China but just generally. So I see we're at time. Let me give kind of the last word to Dave Rank, who again managed this outstanding project, and then we can sign off from there. Dave.
Thanks. And I mean, just like the report, the 8 3-page papers was not enough to do justice to the challenge, nor was 45 minutes or an hour to do discussing it can do justice to it. I want to go back to that last point because I think it's really important, though. You used the adjective problematic. It's way beyond problematic. The sort of allowing our concern about the behavior of Beijing, behavior of the Chinese Communist Party, to undermine American values. It's not only problematic, it is appalling from a perspective of values, but it's also just sort of frankly dumb from a pragmatic perspective, like losing the benefit of Chinese Americans, the contributions that Chinese or Indians or any other group have made to American society, that have made to American technological prowess. I mean, it's just sort of dumb from a strategic perspective, even if you thought that sort of being worse Americans would make us stronger competitors. It would be it's dumb, but it's just, I mean, like land sales, honestly, anyway, don't get me started. It's really great to be part of this effort. The best part about it was working with people like Alan, but particularly people like Ryan and Joanna and the other folks who led these groups. They had a team of people underneath them they brought in, and it just really was refreshing to have viewpoints of like recognizing the real challenge we have, but recognizing the real strengths we have as well. So Alan, thanks for coordinating this. And thanks to Ryan and Joanna and all the other folks I worked with in the process. And thanks to the audience for joining.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. And have a good rest of your day, everybody.